Now, for the percussion instruments, these ones you make sound by hitting them. All of them, you just have to hit them. And I'd show you guys a proper stick and mallet grip right now. I just don't have my sticks and mallets with me right now. But yeah, we'll do that definitely. So, first of all, this is probably what you think of when you think of a drum set. When you think of percussion, you think of a drum set, right? So the middle one, that's probably what you're thinking of when you think of drum set. It's got one big drum in the middle, and then a couple of smaller drums and some cymbals. But there are also a ton of different what are the word? What's the word?
Combinations? Or...
Yeah, configurations. Configurations, yeah. For example, you can have an electronic drum set like the one on the left here. And then you can also have really big drum sets like the one on the right. This one has 2 bass drums. Those are the really big ones. And then we also have the tom-toms, which are the ones over here. And we also have, and most drum sets usually have a snare drum as well. We'll get to those in the next slide. Yeah, so here we have the snare drum. This is a thing you're going to see in a lot of wind ensembles and marching bands. The way the snare drum makes sound, it's sort of a tight sound that you don't, it's a tight sound and it's a nice, short, bright sound. So the way the snare drum makes sound is that there are wires on the bottom head of the snare drum. And when you hit the drum, they vibrate against the bottom head. And by vibrating, they sort of dampen the sound, but they also create that little crack sound you hear when you think of a snare drum. So yeah, they're just like, you can get them in almost any size. The one on the bottom here is a marching snare drum. Those are probably the biggest snare drums you can find anywhere, and they are super heavy. So next one is going to be the bass drum. So the one on the left here, this is a standard concert bass drum. All bass drums, they're super low pitched. It's a big boom sound is what you'd think of when you play a bass drum. So here on the left, we have a concert bass drum that you'll find in an orchestra or in band. Here on the right, we have a drum set snare drum that you'd play with a pedal. And then here is a marching snare drum that you'd hold, like, it'll be right in front of you, and then you hit it with mallets on the side.
And this thing right here, it's a harness so that you can hold it better. Like, so
Yeah.
like marching band, so you can like walk around while playing it.
Yeah. And the next one, we have timpani. I think these are the only pitched drums you'll find. They're drums, but they can play actual notes, like any of the other instruments Michelle and Ubby talked about. And the way you control those notes is by pressing down pedals that are at the bottom here. And the timpani usually come in sets of 4 or 5, but a lot of times there are pieces that only need 2 or 3 drums to play. And there's a very specific technique for playing timpani, and it takes a lot of discipline, it takes a lot of practice to get a nice, good sound out of these. So the next we have our mallet percussion. Now, you might all be thinking that these are just different kinds of xylophones, but no. Only one of these is a xylophone, and it's the one on the left here. The xylophone usually has wood or metal bars and has really short bars underneath it to create a little sort of resonant sound. And the xylophone's characterized by a bright, short sound. sort of like a dink, if that makes sense. And then here on the bottom we have a vibraphone. This is it's usually a softer instrument, but it still has a pretty high pitch, and you play it using soft yarn mallets instead of hard mallets that you'd play on the xylophone. And the unique thing about the vibraphone is it has a pedal on the bottom. You can use that to control how much the vibraphone rings out. So like you could hold down that pedal, hit a note, and it would ring on for a long time. On the left here, we have a glockenspiel, or you can just call them the bells. It's one of the most common instruments you'll find in a concert band, or one of the most common mallet instruments you'll find anywhere. And this is the highest mallet percussion instrument, and the bars are always metal, and they ring out for a really long time. And the way you stop them from ringing out is you just put your finger on the bar and it'll stop. And then the one on the top here is my favorite mallet percussion instrument. It's called the marimba. It's a huge instrument, and you can play low on it or you can play high on it, and it's got a nice warm sound, or it can be bright depending on what mallets you use and how you play it. So it's just one of the most versatile instruments out there. It's amazing. I love it. And then next we have our cymbals. So on the right here we have a crash cymbal, which is kind of what you'd think of when you hear cymbals. You just bring them together and then get a crash out of it. Although it's not as easy as just bringing them together. There is a specific technique you need to use to get a nice sound out of them. And on the right here, we have a suspended cymbal. This one you play with mallets. It hangs from a little stand right there, and you play it with mallets to get a nice sound out of it. I thought it was cool the first time I heard about it. And then next we have our auxiliary percussion. These are like a few common instruments you'll find: our tambourine, a triangle, wind chimes, and a woodblock. And these are just like a few sound effect instruments that composers like to add into their music. Just to add a nice little new sound into the music. And then next is our ensembles. So we'll discuss a little about ensembles before actually diving into these. But since there's no one here, let's move on to different types of ensembles. So a wind ensemble or band includes woodwinds, brass. Sometimes we'll have a double bass and percussion. Woodwinds will have piccolos, flute, oboes, clarinets, bass clarinets, bassoon, alto saxophones, a tenor saxophone, and a baritone saxophone. And usually we'll have the most clarinets. We want to have a lot of clarinets in our band because they're a bit quiet, but they also have a really nice sound to them, so we want to keep those. And then with our brass, we have our trumpets, French horns, trombones, euphoniums, and our tubas. We usually have a lot of brass as well, because wind ensembles are usually a lot louder, and they don't have to hide as much behind the woodwinds because they can also be pretty loud. And also our percussion's very loud as well. And with percussion, it varies a lot by piece, but most of the time we'll have snare drum, bass drum, timpani, and cymbals, and some sort of mallet percussion. And in some professional wind ensembles, like we had at the Regional Honor Band, there'll be a double bass. That's usually to provide a little support for the low end, because while the tuba is super loud and can support the band entirely on its own, The double bass just gives it that little extra oomph to give it that nice, full, rounded sound.
Also, I'm just gonna add, generally, when you're thinking of like wind ensemble, you can just already kind of assume that as many woodwind instruments and brass as you can think of, like everything that comes to mind when you think of those instrument types, like those will be included in wind ensemble. It's only in orchestra where it kind of limits down what instruments are included.
Yeah. So basically, if you choose band in middle school or high school, this is what you're gonna get. This a wind ensemble.
Minus the double bass usually.
Yeah.
In some cases, yes, it is used for that backbone of the ensemble just to support like the tubas. But usually just in like middle school and high school, there's usually not a double bass in band.
Yeah. It's mostly just for color, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next, we have our string orchestra. This is just going to have violin, viola, cello, and bass. Michelle, you want to talk about this a bit?
Yeah. So in string orchestras, they're just usually those main four instrument groups, or like the instruments, I guess, because that's the string instruments, that's the strings family. So in orchestras, the largest section of instruments is always going to be the violin. So the violin, since there's always going to be so many of them, there's always they almost every single ensemble that I can even think of that's just strings will have two sections of violins. They'll have the firsts and the seconds. So within those sections, they're like composers they'll write something just for first violins and something for second violins, and then sometimes there's like different parts within the first and second parts. So within the sections, like the first violins, that is the first chair of the first violins is going to be the concertmaster, the person who leads the whole orchestra. And then like inside of that, there could be like half of them are playing this one part and half of them are playing another part. And that's the same thing goes for the second violins too. So overall, like in a string orchestra, the violins are going to be like the most, not always the most important, but always the most like heard voice in the orchestra. So then after that, we have the violas, which there's usually only one main like part of violas, so there's only like one viola section. But there can be like I said with violin, there can be multiple viola parts within, and that the same goes for cello and bass. Usually, there are significantly less double basses in an orchestra than there are cellos, violas, and violins, just because they have such a full, rich sound that they don't really need to have as many in the ensemble. When they do have a lot of string basses, it's awesome because it's so much like it's so cool. But there usually aren't that many in relation to like the other instruments. And also sometimes with orchestras, they'll have some percussionists come in also just to add some more like sound to the pieces. So sometimes like it won't always happen, but there are like some composers that will include percussionists as well, just for like some specific pieces that they write.